nobody has the right to speak on another party's private platform without their permission. And it's the private owner's right to moderate the use of their platform however they see fit.
But on the other hand, the whole context is Facebook facing pressure, including government pressure, to change their content moderation policies.
The evidence is the fact that when Zuckerberg decides not to comply, suddenly he becomes a target of investigations and in any number of different kinds of implicit threats.
If a government is saying, as our federal government was saying, that if Facebook doesn't moderate content in the way that they agree with, we're going to pass more regulations to control you. And when you have antitrust, that's like such a threat of force that that's a violation of their freedom of speech and more broadly of their rights to liberty. So could Facebook be more outspoken? Yes. So there's an issue of the sanction of the victim here, but this is the role for intellectuals. That intellectuals are supposed to be the voice of a culture and a voice for freedom, rights, and progress.
On January 7th, Mark Zuckerberg announced that, among other changes to policies at Meta and Facebook would be dropping its fact-checking policies, instead using community notes of the type that have recently been pioneered on X. He also said that the platform would begin to remove algorithms that suppressed the discussion of controversial topics in politics, and that instead he would focus those algorithmic filters on illegal content, requiring even higher confidence before taking down accounts. Now, many, including Zuckerberg himself, are calling this a victory for free speech. Is this really a free speech victory? And what, if anything, can we learn from the story of Facebook about the relationship between business and government in a mixed economy? Well, welcome to the Ayn Rand Institute podcast. I'm Ben Baer, fellow at ARI. With me is senior fellow Ankar Gate. Hi, Ankar.
Hi, Ben.
So let's start to examine this topic by, I think, discussing one of the core philosophic concepts that's at the heart of the controversy. If we want to know if this really is a victory for free speech, we need to think a little more carefully about what free speech actually is. And is a social media platform's content moderation policy, whether it's a lighter content moderation or heavier content moderation, is this a free speech issue? Now, I should say, Ankar, at least in my mind, the way that Zuckerberg himself has communicated this to the public is itself somewhat ambiguous, because when he originally announced his policy changes, he talked about wanting to go back to restoring free expression on Facebook, going back to the roots, is the way he described it, the roots of his company. He talks about wanting to reduce censorship. But in the interview that he did with Joe Rogan on his podcast just recently, and I want to play a clip from this, Zuckerberg also said that he didn't think that as free speech versus censorship, as at least embodied in the First Amendment, really was something that applied to private companies. He said it was First Amendment, something that applies to governments. Let's take a look at this clip.
I don't think that the pushing for social media companies to censor stuff was legal. I mean, it's like that's. Right. I mean, there's all this stuff about what, people talk about the First Amendment and okay, these tech platforms should offer free speech like the First Amendment. That I think is a philosophical principle. The First Amendment doesn't apply to companies in our content moderation. It's more of an American ethos about how we think that best dialogue is carried out. But the First Amendment does apply to the government. That's like the whole point, right? Is the government is not allowed to censor this stuff. So at some level, I do think that having people in the administration calling up the guys on our team and yelling at them and cursing and threatening repercussions if we don't take down things that are true is it's pretty bad.
Now I want to come back to the last thing that he talked about there in a moment, the threats that the government was making apparently to Facebook over the past 4 years or so. But even still, on this question of what counts as free speech versus censorship, I tend to think, and you should tell me what you think of this, Encore, but I tend to think that he's right in the second case. That is, he's right that private content moderation policies aren't really censorship, that nobody has the right to speak on another party's private platform without their permission, and it's the private owner's right to moderate the use of their platform however they see fit. When somebody's running a platform that has 3 billion active users, there need to be rules for how it's going to be used. I mean, nobody thinks it's a good idea to let terrorists and drug dealers network on social media. It's not censorship to stop that. Imposing rules about the use of a private platform is not any kind of censorship. Nevertheless, he is describing this latest revision of the rules as a victory for free speech and against censorship. What's your view on this, Ankar?
Yes, I agree with you in the abstract, in the sense that censorship, when we're talking about the First Amendment and what it's prohibiting is government telling private citizens you can or cannot say this, publish that, speak in this way. And the private companies doing that, including social media companies saying, well, we're taking down this kind of post. We have algorithms that will take it down. That is not censorship. That is their content moderation. And any publisher of content should be able to do that in a free society and under the First Amendment. It's what the First Amendment is about these rights are retained by the people. The government can't intrude on these rights. And so the private citizens have the right to decide, if you're publishing content, what content you're going to publish, why, what your rules are going to be, when you're going to take down the content that you later think, well, this is objectionable, and even though we allowed it, we're going to now take it down. Any publisher should have the freedom to do that. So in that sense, yeah, the issue of Facebook changing its content moderation policies is not a free speech. It's an exercise of their free speech rights, but it's not like there's now increase or lessen censorship because they have stricter or looser moderate. There's more. They allow more content and diverse content to be published or not. But on the other hand, the whole context is Facebook facing pressure, including government pressure, to change their content moderation policies. And when you watch the whole interview, part of what Zuckerberg says about his trajectory is, and notice just in that clip, he called it, well, it's not a constitutional issue. The First Amendment doesn't apply to Facebook other than recognizing Facebook's rights, free speech rights to publish what they think they want to publish. But he says it's a kind of American ethos. And there I think he's also speaking of his own perspective that changed, and which he thinks of, now I'm going back to the way I used to look at it. And the way he used to look at it was, I'm building a social media platform for the exchange of ideas, viewpoints, including like a whole wide range of viewpoints of what people think, of what they want to say, of what they want to argue. So I think his view of Facebook content moderation policies was we allowed almost everything that was legal, not literally everything, as long as it's legal, we'll allow it. But they were very hesitant to take down content. And for various reasons, including government pressure, he started to think, well, maybe that kind of perspective on how Facebook as this like massive scale company should operate, maybe that's wrong. And we're going to do more content moderation, take down more posts based on not just sort of the is it illegal or not? But is the content from some perspective objectionable? And that's what he's reversing course on. And so thinking of it as of like I had a certain ethos that comes or was part of and agreed with a certain ethos that comes from we should have wide ranging discussions and we should have a forum for this. And that we had stopped doing that in part because of government pressure. And now we're going to better resist that pressure. That looked at broadly like that, there are for sure free speech issues in that and censorship issues.
So let's drill down a bit into what that government pressure looked like, because this is something that we got a better picture of from the interview that Zuckerberg did with Rogan recently. Let's play the first clip of this where he describes the way he was intimidated by the Biden administration.
At the beginning of COVID, it seemed like, okay, you have this virus. It seems like it's killing a lot of people. I don't know, like we didn't know at the time how dangerous it was going to be. So at the beginning, it kind of seemed like, okay, we should give a little bit of deference to the government and the health authorities on how we should play this. But when it went from, 2 weeks to flatten the curve to, and like in the beginning, it was like, okay, there aren't enough masks. Masks aren't that important. To then it's like, oh no, you have to wear a mask. And, like everything was shifting around. It just became very difficult to kind of follow. And this really hit the most extreme, I'd say, during the Biden administration when they were trying to roll out the vaccine program. And I'm generally like pretty pro rolling out vaccines. I think on balance, the vaccines are more positive than negative. But I think that while they're trying to push that program, they also tried to censor anyone who is basically arguing against it. And they pushed us super hard to take down things that were honestly were true, right? I mean, they basically pushed us and said, anything that says that vaccines might have side effects, you basically need to take down. And I was just like, well, we're not going to do that.
And you might look at that clip and think, well, this is not necessarily evidence of government intimidation. It's just government speaking its voice, speaking up for the policy that it's trying to implement, in this case, rolling out the vaccines, sharing information with private companies, just trying to persuade companies to take down content that the government sees as harmful. But I think when you look at some of the rest of Zuckerberg's story, it's not just that. It's worse than that. And so let's play one more clip from this segment.
I mean, a lot of this is documented. I mean, because, Jim Jordan and the House had this whole investigation and committee into the kind of government censorship around stuff like this. And we produced all these documents and it's all in the public domain. I mean, basically, these people from the Biden administration would call up our team and like scream at them and curse. And it's like these documents it's all kind of out there.
Did you record any of those phone calls?
I don't think we but I think
I want to listen.
I mean, there are emails, the emails are published. It's all kind of out there. And they're like, and basically it just got to this point where we were like, no, we're not gonna take down things that are true. That's ridiculous. And we just said, no, we're not going to take down humor and satire. We're not going to take down things that are true. And then at some point, I guess, I don't know, it flipped a bit. I mean, Biden, when he gave some statement at some point, I don't know if it was a press conference or to some journalists, where he basically was like, these guys are killing people. And I don't know, then like all these different agencies and branches of government basically just like started investigating, coming after our company. It was brutal. It was brutal.
Wow.
And it's that last part, I think, that's especially revealing. That this isn't just government trying to persuade. It's intimidation, and the evidence is the fact that when Zuckerberg decides not to comply, suddenly he becomes a target of investigations and allegations and any number of different kinds of implicit threats. And I think the relevant principle here is that, I mean, so censorship is a use of government force to restrict speech. And force doesn't have to be out in the open for it to still be real and present, and threats of force are a form of the use of force. Ayn Rand wrote an article back in the 1960s called Have Gun Will Nudge, 1962, where she talks about old-fashioned versus, in effect, modern forms of censorship. And there's a quote I'd like to share from that passage, from that article about this topic. She says, censorship in its old-fashioned meaning is a government edict that forbids the discussion of some specific subjects or ideas, such as, for instance, as sex, religion, or criticism of government officials, an edict enforced by government scrutiny of all forms of communication prior to their public release. But for stifling the freedom of men's minds, the modern method is much more potent. It rests on the power of non-objective law. It neither forbids nor permits anything. It never defines or specifies. It merely delivers men's lives, fortunes, careers, ambitions into the arbitrary power of a bureaucrat who can reward or punish at whim. It spares the bureaucrat the troublesome necessity of committing himself to rigid rules, and it places upon the victims the burden of discovering how to please him with a fluid unknowable as their only guide. And to me, it sounds like this is exactly what was happening to Facebook and other social media platforms over the past number of years. We've heard similar allegations coming from Elon Musk about the way that Twitter was treated under the Biden administration, the so-called Twitter files, and it amounts to government delivering its recommended content to these platforms, strongly suggesting they take things down that disagreed with it, and then implicitly threatening to come after them in one form of regulatory assault or another. And I should mention, Ankur, you may recall I wrote an article about this back in 2019, still under the Trump administration, after Facebook was being threatened both by Democrats and Republicans in Congress. The Democrats were critical of Facebook because they thought Facebook helped Trump to get elected. They wanted to start antitrust investigations against Facebook because of that. Meanwhile, Republicans like Ted Cruz were worried that Facebook was censoring conservatives. They wanted to revoke Section 230 protection from Facebook because of that. And at the time, Facebook was again was offering to make changes to its content moderation policy because of that. Before I go further, do you have thoughts on any of that?
So it's interesting in the interview, and I've looked at some of the Jim Jordan report that Zuckerberg is referencing. There he says it's all public now. You can read some of the emails, even though the phone calls weren't recorded. I've looked at some of that. I haven't read it all. It's a very long report. But so it's interesting what was happening behind closed doors, but there was enough, as you just said at the end of what you were saying and referencing your article from 2019, there's enough public that it really doesn't matter what was happening behind closed doors. It doesn't surprise me of how much pressure was also happening closed doors, but the pressure was open and public. That is the threats of force. If a government is saying, as our federal government was saying, and as you said, it's both sides were doing this openly in public, that if Facebook doesn't moderate content in the way that they agree with, and Democrats might have one version of what we would agree if you do this, Republicans might have some other version, we would agree if you do this, but if you don't moderate content in a way that we approve, we're going to pass more regulations to control you. And when you have antitrust, it's including forbidding you from entering into partnerships and even breaking up your company. When that's the alternatives are, change our content moderation policies to be a little more in line with what the government seems to favor, or face increased controls, prohibitions on who we can trade with and what we can sell, and even breakup of the company. That's like such a threat of force that that's a violation of their freedom of speech and more broadly of their rights to liberty. That you could already see that was happening without hearing about the stories behind that were happening, the kind of the non-public pressure that the company was also getting. But it's exactly what one should expect given all the public denunciation and threats that were being made. That, yeah, you would, I mean, if I were guessing in 2019 and forward, are they facing a lot of non-public pressure as well and criticism? Does it surprise me that government officials are calling them and screaming at them? No, none of that surprises me.
But here's where it gets a little tricky, because you could imagine, given what Zuckerberg has told us about the story of the last 6 years or so, that his initial disposition was to want to permit a wide discussion with a variety of ideas, and that when he was pressured by government to restrict that, he went along with it because he was intimidated. And now some of the shackles of that have been removed because there's a change of administrations, and you could imagine, well, this is going back to the policy he might have preferred. And yet, it's still hard to say that this is a victory for free speech, because there's more evidence that the change itself that he's making now may be the result of intimidation coming from the incoming Trump administration. And I mean, it's possible that there's some, he prefers this policy, but even if he didn't, would he be doing anything else? Because, for example, in 2020, Trump vocally threatened Zuckerberg with lifetime imprisonment. Who knows how seriously you should take him when he says things like this? He threatened him with lifetime imprisonment because he thought that Zuckerberg was plotting against him in the election by helping to buy some election ballot boxes. More recently, though, and I think even more seriously, Trump's pick for FCC Commission Chairman, Brendan Carr, sent a letter to Facebook and several other tech companies, and here's the first paragraph and a later excerpt from that, where you see what he's saying to these companies, basically threatening them if they don't change their current content moderation policy. Now, the reason that they want them changed is because they allege that the then current content moderation policies were engaging in censorship. Your companies played significant roles in this improper conduct. Big tech companies silenced Americans for doing nothing more than exercising their First Amendment rights. And he goes on to say, I am confident that once the ongoing transition is complete, the administration and Congress will take broad-ranging actions to restore the First Amendment rights that the Constitution grants to all Americans. And that those actions can include both a review of your company's activities as well as efforts by third-party organizations and groups that have acted to curtail those rights. Well, if it really were the case that it was the Biden administration that was responsible for pressuring Facebook and these other companies, pressuring them to censor on the government's behalf, I would think the proper attitude for an incoming FCC commissioner to take would be to say, you were the victim of previous government policies. We are going to relieve you of that pressure. We're going to permit you to adopt the content policies that you choose by right as an American. But that's not what they're doing. They're in effect blaming the victim. They're in effect saying you were equally guilty to the administration that was trying to force you to do things. I mean, I think that's a supreme example of victim blaming. And so the way I think about this, Ankar, and you tell me what you think, even if it's the case that this is the world in which Zuckerberg would rather be, that this is the content moderation policy he'd prefer to the one he had for the last 6 years, it's really kind of difficult to know if he's doing this of his own volition, or if he's doing it because of these threats that have come from the incoming administration. I mean, the timing here is telling. He's doing it after the election. He even says in this interview with Rogan that he wanted to get a read on what the public was thinking, and he got that read. He saw which way the wind was blowing politically, and now he is going with the prevailing wind.
This is an issue whenever force is introduced into a situation that it should be peaceful and left to the judgment of the individuals involved and the individuals producing and trading. When force is involved, it's often difficult for the victim to know, okay, and what I'm doing is I'm doing it because force has been introduced into this situation, or I would have done this regardless of whether there was someone now wielding a gun. In this case, with the Trump administration coming into, I think from watching the interview, I think it's likely that his position is the Trump administration is going to be better than the Biden administration was. The Biden administration was a disaster. I think from the way he reports the whole situation, he couldn't believe what happened and the extent and the duration of the pressure they were under to toe the government line. And if you're not towing the government line about COVID and so on, you better watch out. But if you notice in that interview, he says this started with COVID. COVID started under the Trump administration. And he said that, like, from the first of it, maybe it makes sense to be deferential to government authorities. Those government authorities and administration is the Trump administration, telling him that he won't name them. But it was worst, he says, under Biden. But he won't name Trump, and you can guess why he won't name Trump, because Trump is the now incoming president, and you don't want to be on the wrong side of him, given how much power an administration can now wield and the kind of threats that they can issue. And as you noted, like, Trump has issued threats against Facebook before. So I suspect there's probably a view that the Trump administration is going to be better. There's a chance we can work with the Trump administration. We couldn't get anywhere with the Biden administration. And he describes it as it ended up being really adversarial. And I think he's trying to avoid that with the Trump administration. He might think it's possible to avoid it. But one way to avoid it, and particularly when you think of Trump and how sensitive he is to criticism and what he wants is blind loyalty, is even things that he would be critical of that Trump did or might do, he's not going to voice now, because that will set off Trump. And yeah, he has who knows what he would do with antitrust and so on. And he's threatened this before. And so it's, let alone for us from the outside saying, like, why is Mark Zuckerberg doing this? I think it's hard for Mark Zuckerberg to know fully why. Is it that I'm going back to what my policies were before? Or is this the more prudent thing given the power that government yields? And it's very difficult, just if you've ever been in a situation where you're under some force, to know your own reasons for why you're doing what you're doing. And that's part of what's perverse about the introduction of force into situations and relationships that should be peaceful and private, and not, well, if you step out of line, a gun is going to descend on you, or might descend on you.
Yeah, and so all of this makes me think that even as there is a case to be made that the Trump administration is going to be better for companies like Zuckerberg's, this still isn't really a victory for free speech. It's at the end of the day, a company is changing its policies that were dictated by one regime in favor of new policies that are dictated by another. And so there's a real respect in which the company is the victim here, not the villain. But I think we shouldn't wrap this up until we discuss one important respect in which companies like Facebook, I think, are not just victims, in which they do bear a certain amount of the guilt, because I think that you can make a case that they could have stood up for themselves in a much stronger way on these kinds of issues, where if they were if they were actually being victimized, they could have drawn attention to this fact. They could have claimed that they were being victimized. They could have argued against it. And it's unfortunate that they only get to do this, they only choose to do this after their victimizers are out of power, and now there's somebody else who they still, as you noted, Onkar, don't want to blame. Back in 2019, at the same time I wrote that article previously, part of what sparked the article then was that Zuckerberg and his policy chief, Nick Clegg, they both authored op-eds for the New York Times and the Washington Post, where they were actually calling for a more active role for government and regulators in vetting harmful content. They'd been given so many different dictates. They'd tried to comply, and they basically were giving in and saying, well, you guys, you can be the ones to tell us what to do. And you can understand this, I think, in a way, as a kind of consequence of the intimidation as a result of the pressure that they were being subjected to. You get a sense, especially from watching this interview with Rogan, that Zuckerberg is the kind of person who would really rather spend his time building cool technology, building products. He doesn't want to have to think about content moderation policies. He doesn't want to have to think about government policy or government threats. He'd rather work with technology. And so as a result of that, he decides, well, maybe if I just do what the government says, appease them, invite them to regulate us, they'll leave us alone, and then I can get along to building technology. So you can understand that kind of attitude. I don't think it really excuses it, though. I mean, we're talking about a company here and an individual like Zuckerberg who has very deep pockets, who could use those resources to mount a vocal, principled defense of his company and its right to vet content as it chooses with a heavy hand or with a light hand, whichever it prefers. But they decide not to do that. And instead, they decide to ask for a regulatory response. They invite the regulators in to tell them to do what they need to do. They think that this kind of appeasement will let them off the hook, but I think in reality what it does is simply to invite more of it. And a good example of how this is true you can see very recently with Zuckerberg apparently giving in to the demands of the incoming administration, changing content moderation policies to the way that they would rather see it happen. And what happens? Well, Republican Senator Marsha Blackburn goes on Twitter after Zuckerberg's announcement and says, now that President Trump is about to take office, Meta has allegedly decided to stop censoring conservatives. This is a ploy to avoid being regulated. We will not be fooled. And so here is the incoming Republican regime saying, you thought that this act of compliance would get us off your back. No, we're still going to find ways to regulate you. And I mean, this is the podcast of the Ayn Rand Institute, and of course, we try to apply Ayn Rand's philosophy to contemporary events. And here, the most relevant aspect of her philosophy to talk about is the idea of the sanction of the victim, the principle that gets elaborated in her novel Atlas Shrugged, which holds that evil gains its power over innocent people only because innocent people empower it, only because they sanction that power. They cooperate with that power in one way or another. And I think we see something like that happening now. It's applicable in spades to the relationship between government and business, especially in the tech industry. I mean, Ayn Rand thought that business people were heroes, that they were the ones who were responsible for applying knowledge from science to technology and industry and lifting us all out of poverty, creating an enormous standard of living. But she also thought at the same time that they bore a substantial guilt for unleashing evil on the world by appeasing their destroyers and empowering them to destroy the rest of us. To stop that, she thought they needed to become more sensitive to the role of ideas, to the role of philosophy, that it's not just hot air. You understand, business people are not interested in philosophy. They're interested in business. They're interested in technology. But but philosophy is important. It's the fuel that empowers or burns down the builders. And in this case, it's philosophic ideas about the rights of business people to engage in free commerce and free speech that Facebook is unwilling to stand up for. And because of that, it's allowing government in one form or another to restrict its activities.
It's such a mixed bag here, because I have a lot of respect for Zuckerberg on these issues, and I think he's the best of the tech CEOs on these issues. Because part of what he says about the resistance they had to the Biden administration is that they thought, for a lot of it, no, what we're doing is not only right, it's also legal. So there's not some argument that can be made that we're somehow engaged in illegal activity. And so we'll go to court. And part of what he said in the interview is we won most of the cases. And that is a type of fighting back. But it's not the fighting back in the, as we'll often put it, in the court of public opinion, of saying, like, there's something, we shouldn't even be going to court for these things. There's something that's really wrong with what the government's doing. He's saying some about that, but just about the Biden administration now, which I think is good to say that when, I mean, the clip that we played of him, that there's something really wrong from the perspective of the First Amendment, of a government coming and trying to pressure us to say, well, this is what you should be saying and this is what you shouldn't be saying, that there's something inherently wrong with that. And there is something wrong. And exposing that and calling that out is something good. And even on the side of regulations, I think it's a mixed bag. And for many big firms, this is what happens. There's all kinds of threats of, well, we might do this, we might repeal Section 230, we might. Business cannot operate with that level of uncertainty, that every 6 months the laws and controls might change. So we did all this to try to accommodate it, and now they're reversing course. So they want stability. Even if there's going to be controls and regulations, it's better if, okay, this is what it's going to be, now try to operate within this, versus it's going to shift every 6 months and we're going to do whatever we want to do. It's going to be chaotic and unpredictable. So when they ask for what we want, yeah, okay, government and regulators get together and issue some policies so that we can operate. There's often a defensive element to that, of like, because the alternative is just continuous chaos and threats. So I can understand why a CEO of a company the size of Facebook would say, yeah, just figure out what your controls are going to be, and then we'll try to operate within those. But when you get companies the size of Facebook, they can comply with controls in a way that new and competitors and upstarts cannot. And there's often an element of, yeah, we don't mind, and maybe it would be even good to have controls and government bureaucrats doing all kinds of good, because we can comply with that and we can pay the cost of compliance and continue to do business and make profits. And these upstart competitors are going to have a much harder time to do that. So there's an element that often happens with big companies that this is, yeah, okay, this is to our competitive advantage, even though it's inherently anti-competitive for government to be controlling the industry. And is there an element of that Zuckerberg in asking for the regulatory agencies to just issue some rules? Was there an element of, yeah, of course we can comply with them, and so much the worse for our competitors? There often is. I don't know in this case if there was, but there often is when you look at big business. And the other, so could Facebook be more outspoken? Yes. Will they be more outspoken? Maybe. Like, that's part of what this might be a sign of. But on the other hand, will they say anything negative about anything the Trump administration does? But I would say, so there's an issue of the sanction of the victim here, of it would be better to speak out. But I would put this caveat on that. This is the role for intellectuals. That intellectuals are supposed to be the voice of a culture and a voice for freedom, rights, and progress. if there were intellectuals, and not only us at the Ayn Rand Institute, but like that, you could say there's a real cultural voice that's defending Facebook and the other tech companies. And when they were hauled before Congress, if there was a real intellectual outrage about this, about Congress should not be threatening any of these companies, that if you don't do and moderate content in the way that we prefer, you're going to face all kinds of repercussions and controls and damages. If there were intellectual voices defending Facebook, and in that context, if a CEO of Facebook, Zuckerberg, wouldn't say anything, wouldn't say, yeah, like I agree with these voices, and so there would be much more culpability for it. But in the context where the intellectual voices prominent in the culture are against Facebook, and then you have the politicians and the government, like in an environment where everyone seems against you, and you're not a philosopher or an intellectual, so you don't know fully how to. I mean, that's part of just thinking about censorship. I think there's a reason he uses that term. It's not the right term. It confuses, and so. But he has no allies who are helping him understand this. And if you don't have that, I have more sympathy that you're unable to speak out. And drawing on the parallel to Atlas Shrugged, this is what happens in Atlas Shrugged. It, like, part of the meaning of the whole story is there's intellectuals giving ammunition voice to businessmen to help them stand up to the kind of persecution they face. And if we're going to move towards a better culture, that's what has to happen.
Yes, and even if there aren't major intellectuals in the culture who are standing up for rights of business people, who are unwilling to stand up for them themselves, that's something that we at the Ayn Rand Institute are here to do in the absence of anybody else. So thanks for joining me to discuss this, Ankar, and I hope our audience appreciates what it is we try to do here. For the sake of the audience who'd like to learn more about this subject, I have a couple of resources I'd like to recommend. One is the essay I referenced, a passage from earlier in the program from Ayn Rand, Have Gun, Will Nudge. This appeared in the Objectivist newsletter in 1962, and this is a good opportunity to mention that we have recently republished the full Objectivist newsletter in paperback form, so it's a pretty reasonable price you can get on Amazon. If you go to Amazon, look up the Objectivist newsletter, there's a link on screen that will take you right to it. That will, you'll be able to take a look at that, plus a lot of other commentary on subjects related to free speech and regulations that she was writing in the early 1960s against the then Kennedy administration. And then there's an article that I referenced a couple of times in this episode that I wrote back in 2019, Facebook, Censor or Victim. If you go to bit.ly/censor or victim, you can read that essay from New Ideal, August 12th, 2019. As usual, if you enjoyed this podcast and you'd like to follow us on one of the many social media platforms that provide this service to us without our even paying for it, if you're watching on YouTube, click that bell, get the notifications when we go live or post new recordings. If you're watching the recording, please be sure to leave a comment, share it, like it to attract new viewers, help us work those algorithms in our favor. And as always, if you have questions, send us an email to newideal@aynrand.org. We try to read all the email that comes in. We answer a good amount of it. Sometimes we take suggestions for new topics. So thanks, everyone, and thank you, Ankar. We will see you again next week.